Welcome to the Profit Answer Man, Doug Brown. It's great to have you join us today.
Hey, Rocky. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm so grateful to be here.
And I'm excited for the conversation and to learn from you. Can you share a little bit about yourself and your business?
A little bit about myself. I just turned 63, so I'm still kicking around. That's pretty good. I've been working now for 60 years. It's like crazy to think back on how long that's been. I started working in my dad's business at age 3. Uh, yeah, I swept floors for 25 cents a week. I loved it. It was awesome. I got to hang out with the adults. They bring me to lunch at the place was called Starboard Gallery, and they'd prop me up on the bar, and they'd have their beers, and I'd have my whatever the Roy Rogers or whatever it was back then. And I don't think my mother really appreciated it. I heard her talk to my dad a few times about that, but all us boys worked with my dad, and I worked with my dad and grew side businesses while I was doing that up till about age 19. Entered the military, and then had side businesses through the military. And then when I got out of the military, you're supposed to finish college, so I did that. Uh, and I sold music equipment all the way through college, and I sold that to a lot of the famous bands that we all listened to on the radio. That was a lot of fun. Aerosmith and the Eagles and Billy Joel's band and all that. And then, I got medical degrees. So I was like, hey, I'm going to be a doctor, work in the hospitals. But when I got in there, I realized it's a business. So I decided if I'm going to be in business, I might as well go in business. So I hopped back out, tried a sales position in a corporate job, and did extremely well there. And from there, I built, I would say, probably my first real company, my consulting and auditing company in telecommunications, and did extremely well in that. That led me on to helping other companies and coaching them and being involved in that. Eventually, I ended up helping a guy called J. Conrad Levinson, who wrote a book series called Guerrilla Marketing. And he introduced me a guy named Chet Holmes, and I asked Chet if I could help coach for his company, and they gave me a shot, and I became the number one coach, eventually the president of the training and sales for that company. And then Tony Robbins comes along and he buys into the company, and I do that with Chet and Tony for 7 years. And, so it just kind of continued on. I've helped Russ Whitney, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. He owned that, a bunch of other brands. And, I've through my life, I've consulted, coached, built businesses, and done it with lots of well-known brands and people who we'd never even know, but had really good businesses.
I just connected with something. I was down with Amanda, Chet's
Uh-huh.
daughter, a couple of
Yeah.
weeks ago. I was like, oh, I know that.
Yeah,
When you
yeah.
started
Amanda was,
mentioning the names, it kind of all came together.
she was just a little girl when I met her. I mean, she was tiny, when I
She's
met her.
not that old, I was going to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think led to all that success and always being at the top? What did you do differently?
Well, I think part of it was insanity, honestly. I think part of it was the driver of how I grew up. I was very close to my dad. I grew up in an environment on my mom's side, especially where, good was never good enough. It didn't matter. If you got an A, you should have had an A plus. If you were, selling music equipment to the Eagles, it was like, why not Pavarotti? It was like that type of environment. And I think that was a driver to like kind of prove my worth. And through that, what I perceived probably as an early on, like not a really great childhood, but as I grew older, I realized, our greatest weakness can become our greatest strength, right? So I was just driving through that process to say, hey, I'm somebody, prove to the world that I am. It worked. I mean, I've sold $1 billion worth of stuff, but the reality is I think that's what drove me. But there was always this inherent curiosity I had, even since a little boy, that I wanted to know about people, what made them tick. I wanted to figure out what was the reason behind the reasons. And I always kind of kept turning over stones. And in business, that was a very helpful thing to entrepreneurs, because I would look at something and I'd go, they're saying they have this problem, but why do they have the problem? I know what the symptoms are, but what is the cause? And so when I would look for the cause, then I would find the root cause of that. And if you want to remove a problem or get an opportunity or gain a goal, you find out what the cause is either stopping you or the cause that made it successful, and you remove the cause, no more problem. If you capitalize on the cause and just do what Tony talked about, which is model, right? That process, then you'll arrive at your goal a lot faster. And I think those are the kind of the combinations of what made it work.
Do you find that most people solve the symptom or solve the problem?
No, they solve the symptom most of the time. They in business, they look at a symptom and they say, so for example, many a business owner I've talked with in the past is like, my sales team, they're awful, right? And they would say something like that, right? And I'd be like, well, tell me about it. And they'd be like, I don't know what they're doing. They're never doing what they're supposed to be doing most of the time. And, they hit the numbers here and there. It's up and down, up and down. And I'd be like, okay, so those are all symptoms, right? They're not really expressing. So what do you want to do? I think I'll fire them all. That would be the thing. And I'll rehire a new team. And I would ask questions like, okay, so tell me why they're having up and down numbers. And they would say, well, I don't know. They're seeming to feast or famine. Some months I think they're prospecting, some months they're not. And then I would ask the question, well, how are you tracking that? And they'd be like, well, they give me the numbers at the end of the week. And I'm like, and you're believing them? And we would start to drill down on it. And I'd find out they had zero tracking going on the system of holding their accountability to their sales team, except from emotion. So they were just looking at symptoms constantly. And then when you drill down to the symptom, that's okay. But then when you find out what the cause is, it actually turned out in most cases to be the leader of the company wasn't actually doing what they needed to do to manage the process, or they had like I had a solar company for one time, got to fire the whole sales team and, but was afraid to do it because they didn't know how to get another sales team. But when I looked at what was going on, they were like, we're not getting sales. And I'm like, nobody's following up on a lead for 28 days to 30 days. Right. And so where's your system when your lead hits to time the lead to the actual contact of the lead? And they were like, what are you talking about? Right. So they were just dumping money out, Rocky, over and over and over and over. And so the symptom was we're losing and hemorrhaging money. My sales team's telling me everything's fine. But again, you got to look at the cause of the problem. That if we're looking to solve a problem, just always remove the cause and the problem will go away because there's no more cause. Now you might create another problem, but the reality is most of the time that solves the issue. So yes, I think they look at it in business. And they certainly look at it in life, especially around health, because that's how doctors treat most people. You got this, give me a pill, solve the symptom, but it's not necessarily solving the underlying cause most of the time.
We need a laugh track because I was laughing the whole time you're talking because this is the conversations I have with business owners. Invariably sure. The answer is we need more revenue. And I'm like, more revenue is not going to solve anything but cause more problems until you fix the underlying systems, processes, and problems that are actually there. Then you can have more revenue, but then you might not even need more revenue. You might be able to do everything you're doing with the revenue you have if it's done well. Because at the end of the day, I'm a big fan of work less, make more, and more revenue is not always the answer to that solution.
No, sometimes more revenue in a quick fashion will implode the company. And I did this by making a mistake early on in my career. I was talking to a gentleman. They did steel buildings. They pre-framed steel buildings. They stuck them up. And I did a study for him and just looked at how can he grow, right? And I came back with that and I found this one idea and I was like, I'm not going to tell this guy because he's the type of guy that'll just take it and run. So, I told him, I said, look, here's your plan, but I'm not going to give you the plan because I know you're the type of guy who'd take this and you need to get your operations in order first and all your processes in place, because if you grow, you're going to be out of your mind. I mean, it's just the way it is. He said, no, I won't do that. I'm like, yes, you will. We went back and forth. He's like, finally, he goes, listen, I pinky swear on my children's soul that I will not do this. And I said, all right, well, and I gave him the information. Now he was $5.7 million when I was doing this. 3 weeks later is $8.2 million. And so I called and he wasn't calling me back. And so it was a family business. So I called his daughter and I said, hey, what's up with your dad? Is he okay? And she goes, I don't know what happened. He and the rest of this company is out of their mind. I've got people who are turning in notices to quit. I've got this going on. And I said, well, what happened? She said, I don't know. We grew by a few $1,000,000. And I was like, oh, you got to be kidding me. Did this happen? And she said, yes. And I'm like, son of a gun, he did it. Right. And so, companies can grow too fast. And when they're not looking at the foundation, it's kind of like, that one little thing that they didn't pay attention to can unravel it. So this is why we always do a sales optimization study before I'll even work with anybody anymore, because if I don't do that and they start implementing ideas and we just don't know what's underneath the underneath the what, then all these like little gremlins start crawling out sometimes. So, but yeah, I mean, but a good solid plan to grow is certainly smart. But again, if they want profit, like what you focus on profit, sometimes even growing revenue at a loss doesn't make sense.
And that's the problem. I think a lot of times they don't realize that growing revenue is what's driving their losses. They just think the next sale, like
Yeah.
they need to get over a hump. And if I get to 1 million, it'll be solved. They get to 1 million. Well, when I get to 10 million, it'll be solved. When I get to 100 million, it'll be solved. It's never going to be solved until you solve it, right?
I,
Getting to the problem to begin with. And that's just the reality of it.
yeah, I looked at a company. I won't mention his name because people will know it. But they were doing $1 billion, a little over $1 billion a year, and they were losing 70 million a year. And on the top, it looked very like companies were doing great, right? It's kind of like I don't know what happened with 23andMe, but I'm going to make the assumption something similar happened. Where you have this brand name thing that looks like it's doing really great, but underneath there's all this erosion that's going on within the company. And then, there's a focus on let's just keep growing and growing and growing and growing. And that's okay as long as it's controlled, scalable growth that is profitable. There are reasons to grow. I mean, Jeff Bezos proved this, right? There are reasons to grow without profit. If you're trying to build that type of model, or you're in an industry where you can scale it quickly and then somebody will buy you out for a higher multiple or something like that. But in most cases in business, it doesn't exist. And, there was a friend of mine, Chris, who said something to me early on in my life. He said, Doug, if you're going to build a business, build it like you're going to hold on to it because you think you're going to sell it, but you may never get a buyer.
The amount of businesses that are sold versus the amount of businesses for sale is a tiny fraction.
Yeah, absolutely. And when they do sell, most of them don't sell for what the owners think they're going to sell for because they've been built on either a personality or a concept that's not transferable, or the numbers just don't look really good. And so, that's why when a company goes public, they'll try to immediately widen out the profit as high as possible when they're ready to, when they try to sell. They'll widen out the profit as much as possible so that they can get a better multiple. But most business owners never build a business understanding how to exit the business. And they just get themselves in a position and they find out. I'm actually evaluating one right now, or two of them actually, that I'm looking at. And I'm like, one of them's not that big. It's doing like $1 million on the top line, but the bottom line is so bad that the company's not even worth anything. And they're like trying to get like $400,000 for this company. I don't know anybody with a brain cell in their head that would ever offer that type of money for this company because, they're just hemorrhaging. So it's really a fire sale asset at this point for them. Profits, and I'm always a proponent of, you can grow your revenue, but grow it intelligently and grow it with the profit, in mind. Because again, even if you're growing a company to sell it in a quick period of time, it may not sell. So, turning it upside down is never a favorable thing, especially when you're using your own money.
So how do we do this correctly? You and I both use the same language, but I don't like to say it out loud because people don't like to hear it. Math-based metrics, right? The entire business is a math equation. And when you understand the math of your business, it becomes really easy to make choices and decisions and see what lever point is holding you back and what small changes you can make to get everything flowing. But I don't know, people just don't like the word math.
Well, who likes, there's a small population who embraces math in school, right? It's like, oh, I got math class today. Yay. Right. It's like, no, geez. But the challenge is, I think it's how they look at the word math, right? It's like when somebody, says, oh, salesperson, right? There's like a used car, they'll start to go there. Many of people are, but it's not, like I know many used car salespeople that are just the most ethical people in the world. So it's just a perception. And we're not talking about doing advanced calculus or, quadratic equations or stuff like that. We're talking about basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division type math, right? Mm-hmm. So when people say math, I always say to them, they go, oh, it's a math-based system. And I go, yeah, math, right? But it's easy math, right? It's pretty fourth to sixth grade level math when it comes down to it, from my perspective. So here's the deal. Every single thing in a business that can be measured should be measured. You and I both know this, right? The measurements between the metrics, the ratios between the metrics, really are the math, really, when it comes down to it. So if we take something as basic as outreaches on a sales team, sales teams reaching out to someone to try to get a conversation going. So we have outreaches, then we can measure from how many outreaches were there to how many connection rates were made. We can measure from how many connection rates to how many positive or negative responses we were getting. Let's just take that little ratio there. Outreaches to connections. If we look at the outreaches and we see the connection rate is extremely low, we can then go, aha, this methodology we're using either isn't working appropriately or we can make it better. Let's look at what it is. Now, when we look at what it is, because we're looking, let's say just make the math easy, 100 outreaches, 6 connections, really low, right? A low 6% conversion, not even conversion, just connection ratio. We can look and now this gives us cause to go investigate to say, what is the issue going on with this? And we think maybe, well, okay, maybe it's the method we're using. We're using, I don't know, pick anything, LinkedIn, cold calling, whatever it might be. But actually, it may not be that. It might be just the messaging that's being used. I have a friend, his name's Dave, and in his case, it was his connection rate was targeting, very low targeting. And so, with Dave came to me one day, Rocky, and he says, there are no good women left in the United States. I said to him, what? I'm like, your mother's not good. There's no, your grandmother, like we were talking. And it turned out Dave he said, no, there are no good women that I can find that want to go out with me. And I said, well, there's a different target, Dave. So long story short, we talked through the targeting, and Dave wanted a church-going woman that had a master's degree that was between the age of 35 and 45. And we started targeting all this down. And I asked Dave, I said, where are you looking? He goes, well, I go to the local bars. And I did the same thing you're doing. And I'm like, Dave, what kind of church-going woman who has a master's degree, who wants a family, who doesn't cuss, all these things that he wants, are hanging out at a local bar? And he said, well, I never thought of it that way. And I said, well, so when you're going, I said, so you're making approaches. What are your responses in these bars? And he's going, well, I'm not really getting responses because I can't find the connection. Like I go out there and I'm like, there you go, right? So we changed it to go to a college mixer for master's degrees and above at a church-going university like Holy Cross or whatever. And, Dave found the gal two mixers later, and he was married to her forever, right? So it's like, this is a very silly example, but in business, it's not much different, folks. You've got to measure between the ratios. If you're getting a certain response rate, it might be good, but you might be able to optimize that response rate. And then if you optimize the response rate, you're probably going to get more appointments if it's a positive response rate. And then you can measure, how many appointments did I set? How many appointments did I get? How many appointments abandoned? How many appointments are doing this? All these ratios through your business will tell you stories. And and so there's different ratios, and you got to pick the ones that are meaningful to what we think they should be. But it's all basic math.
It is very basic math. What you were talking about were on the sales side's ratios. And we like to look at all of that because that's how we can predict the future. In other words, if we say, hey, if you do 100 of these outreaches, we know that you're going to end up with, I think you said 6, connections, which in 6 months is going to return 1 sale. So I know if I do X today, 6 months from now, there's a good chance that I'm going to get this return. When you can map that out, you can start to predict the future. We take that further, though. There's the ratio of, hey, your gross profit. If your gross profit is here, and that ratio, you're not going to be able to pay your overhead. But if our gross profit's here, well, at that ratio, we can pay our overhead, and we have a lot. And you can go down even further than that to look at the amount of time that people take to pay. And I can look at the same business and I can just change how you get paid. And I can go from cash flowing to not cash flowing, and to blowing up a business to never worrying about money again. And so again, it's all of these things throughout every single part of the system.
Yeah. And I worked with a company that had, it reminds me, they used to install utility poles. Fascinating business. I didn't even know, when you think about a business, it's like they were a newer company, less than 2 years old, and they were doing $17 million a year installing utility poles. And I asked them how their cash was flowing, and they said, well, we got a problem there. I said, what do you mean? They go, we're like 60 days out of business. And I'm like, why? And they go, I don't know. I'm like, let's look at your books. Rocky, they were 180 days in most cases. They have not collected almost $12 million.
Like I said,
Right?
that's simple. Had you got paid up front before the poll went in, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Had you got paid in 30, even if you had gotten paid 50-50, right? 50 before, 50 after, if you got a decent profit margin, even if you don't get the other 50, you've at least paid your costs, right?
Yep.
And so you
Yeah,
survive.
And there's example after example that I can, like when you were talking, like I remember there was one company, they were having challenges growing, and he was blaming the sales team. And he had like 42 salespeople at the time. He was blaming the sales team, blaming the sales team, blaming the sales team. And I was like, okay, numbers looked okay on the sales team. I was like looking at it. But I did catch a ratio in the company that he had an 82% turnover rate of his employee base every year.
Where's the we need the laugh track. I seriously, you know.
And I went, and when you see things like this, when you're measuring ratios, folks, when you see things and it reveals you have an 82% turnover ratio, there's a challenge going on that's not just the sales challenge, right? And we can probably all agree to that. But the reality is I dug into that, and here's what I found out what was the problem. It wasn't the sales team that was causing the actual problem within the company. He couldn't hold on to operational or support staff within the company. And it turned out to be one salesperson that was the problem. And so once we removed that salesperson out of the mix, his 82% ratio went away. And all of a sudden he's retaining great talent and things were flowing through far more. So what was happening is it was in the operation side, it got stuck, or somebody would quit, or they take the order and they throw it out the window because they were ticked off at the salesperson and they quit and they go away. All these crazy things were happening. So once we removed the impediment, the cause of the problem, the problem, and by the way, they grew, they were doing 48 million. They grew from 48 million to 110 million in 2 years just by doing that. There's a lot of cool things that people, if they would just pay attention to the math in their business, as you were saying, gross profit, what a cost of goods, all these things. And people, they know to do this, but they don't generally do this on a regular basis. They don't have meetings to actually watch these things.
No, nor do they have what I call is a good scoreboard. We just, right. I just created a new scoreboard for one of my clients, and they look at cash flow every week, and I'm like, okay, but your scoreboard doesn't show you week to week. You can go see week to week by doing a little bit of work, but having everything laid out in one simple place that you can look at the line and go, oh, it's up, it's down, and being able to just immediate, or just a graph, right? It went up, it went down. You start to see things, you start to see trends, you can make better decisions. I find very few people create scoreboards in their business. And when you have a scoreboard, it becomes real easy to not go, I think things are going well. You can say things are going well. And just by looking at the scoreboard, you can see if there's a problem occurring or a trend line somewhere. And it could be simply as, how long does it take from order to shipment? And if you're normally at 48 hours, and that's great, at Amazon, it's delivered 2 days prime. Well, if you start to notice that it's now 4 days, you're not meeting your commitments, and you can start to see that drift. And you should be able to. But unfortunately, without a good way to do that, you're guessing, and then you're fixing the wrong things. What I always say is, a lot of where profit is lost doesn't show up on the P&L. The P&L tells me there's a problem, but it won't tell me there's one sales rep who's making 82% of the people quit.
Yeah.
But the result's there. And so it begins the beginning of a search to figure out what is the underlying cause. And I think a lot of times when you're in a business, you're too close to the business. And so you're in the weeds, you can't see that big picture. And so sometimes having that external view, and it doesn't have to be a consultant, there's 100 ways to do this, to look at it really helps.
Well, I think, we all I'm trying not to get into trouble here, but
get in trouble. Let's have fun.
you know, your significant other, let's say my wife comes and she'll come with a dress and shoes or whatever, and she'll say, well, how do I look? Right. And right. So it's the same thing in the company. If we just presented that and said, how does this look? And you have somebody who's not going to say, oh, you'll just look, those shoes are amazing, or I mean, if you literally say shoes don't look so good, whatever, based on, we're going dancing and you're wearing bowling shoes, let's say, I mean, it's like that type of thing. And not that my wife would do that, but the point being is that I'm trying to be to the ridiculous so that people understand having somebody, independently look at your business repetitively is not a bad idea, because they spot things you won't. And, you'll look at margins and numbers that the business owner may not. And here's the reason I tell people to do this. I was working with a company, they were a medical type company, and they were doing, I think, somewhere around 45 million a year. And I always tend to look at the books, look at the numbers. And I was like, something's off in the numbers. I couldn't figure out what it was. Right. But I'm like, you should have more money coming through here than you have in coming through. And I said, who's doing doing your books or whatever on this? He's like, well, the chief financial officer is doing this and they're doing this with the bookkeeper, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, all right, let's take a look deeper. Well, it turned out that the chief financial officer had embezzled about $2 million over the last 2 years out of the company. And the owner was like, no, this is a friend of mine. They wouldn't do that. And I'm like, go have it independently audited by your CPA firm or whatever, right? Because I'm just saying, listen, the money's missing. Nobody can tell me where it is. Points back to this. And sure as heck, that's what he did. And that's what was going on. But, that's a lot of money to lose a lot, every year. When we're just basically losing $1 million, I mean, that's affecting profitability like crazy on a business. So that's why I would recommend that people do it. Like you said, they don't have to necessarily have a consultant come in, but I mean, if they line budgeted something in there for somebody to look at their business every single year, I think it would be a smart move. I mean, major corporations have departments looking at their numbers on a regular basis. And that's the reason why, because there's so much that could bleed out quickly. And, so they catch it. And you sure as heck on a bigger company, the IRS is sitting in their building doing that on a weekly basis so they don't lose their money. So, yeah. So, why not act like the bigger companies? It's not that much money really when it comes down to it, Rocky. And then the amount of money that people can head off from bleeding out of the company or capitalize on something that's happening. Not only just on the expense side, but on the opportunity side of the business as well.
And I concur with you. We have a saying, we'll tell you the truth even if you fire us. Because we're not afraid to say those shoes look ugly with that dress, or, yeah, sorry, but you paid us to tell you the truth and we're going to tell it to you. And if you don't like it, so be it. But sometimes you got to face the reality of it. And kind of what you're talking about, a lot of times I'll work with business owners and they're like, well, I can't raise prices 10%. I'm in a tight market. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. And some of them don't realize, they're like, oh, we're just losing a little money over there. 1% losses or 1% gains times 10 is 10%.
Right.
And for a lot of businesses, 10% might be double the profit you're making now. It
Right.
might be taking you from 0 profit to 10% profit. If you're a $10 million company, that's $1 million, right? So the metrics make a big, big difference depending on size. And it's all small things done well. And I think we forget to look at the little stuff. And that's where it all bleeds out.
Yeah, because I mean, if we're stopping the bleed, let's say they're bleeding at 1% in 3 areas, right? There's a 3% recovery right there. So it's not necessarily about you just, and that's what business owners always do. They're like, oh, I've got to raise my prices, or I got to do this, or I got to do that. Not necessarily, right? It could be within the effectiveness or the efficiency of a division or department that you could find that lost number. So across the whole company, you might be able to find that 10% pretty. It's not usually that hard. I don't feel, Rocky, to find a 5 to 15% kick up on an increase for most companies. It's just because they're running at a certain way. Like I remember one time I went into a company and I said, let's look at your expenses. And they just negotiated a bill with AT&T. And I looked at the numbers, and I had just done this with another client. And I looked at it and I said, you guys can save an extra $500,000 a year on the same phone bill that you have. and you're within your 30-day right of being able to do it. And they're like, no, that can't happen. I'm like, sure it can, right? Here's a contract that shows the same thing that, the previous client. So, because the client I was not under non-disclosure. The client was like, sure, show them to it. I don't care. But, there's $500,000 a year just bleeding out of the company, right? So there's all kinds of ways of finding it. So, the reason I'm championing what you're saying is because a lot of times business owners are like, no, I can't find this, or I can't raise my prices, or I can't. Yeah, and maybe you can't, but you may not be able to go up 10%, but you might be able to go up 1.5%, right? And I mean, no one is going to say, hey, this chicken at $20, now it's $20 and whatever, 40 cents. I'm not buying it. I mean, it's very, there is price sensitivity if we raise the chicken from $20 to $36 or something, but not unusually on small micro raises.
Here's the thing, though. If you raise the price of chicken from $20 to $36 and you lost half your customers,
Might still be better.
you'd still be better. And that's
Yeah.
the math nobody does,
Yeah.
is to look at, wait, we could lose 10 or 20, 30% of our clients and make more money with less work, and then we wouldn't have the chaos and the craziness.
Yeah.
That's an interesting concept. And then we test it and we try it and we see how it works.
So one of the side businesses I had, Rocky, was actually a DJ company early on in my life, right? And I started doing DJ work at $200 a job. And I got 200 jobs in my first year. I was crazy. I was out like every weekend, multiple jobs. It was insane. So if you think about it, that's, $40,000. So a friend of mine, Chris, comes along and he says, raise your prices. And I said, no, I can't do that. I said, well, what do I raise them to? He goes, go to $600. And I'm like, what? And he's like, Doug, you're a really good DJ. You'll still get work and you'll make your $40,000 and you'll make it faster. You'll have better clients and you'll have better working conditions. So it took me about 6 months before I raised my prices, but then I went up to 300 and then 400 and then 500 and then 600 and they kept coming. So I went up to 800 and then 1,000 and then 1,200 and then 1,400, at the end, we were doing about 23 jobs a year at $2,000 a job. I was making $46,000 a year, working 23 jobs versus 200 jobs a year, making $40,000 a year. And I played high-end country clubs, McDonald's Christmas party, things like that. So the point being is that what you're saying is absolutely true. I think what happens is most business owners, they're afraid that they're going to lose something when they do this and they never test it.
You know what they lose? They're pain in the ass clients.
Yeah, a lot of times.
That's what you lose.
Yeah.
The ones who love you are like, thank God you raised your prices. I want to make sure you stay in business.
Yeah. And if you look at this from any business, like let's go back to the restaurant, right? There are places that charge $100 for chicken and they're still open, right? So I think it just depends on, I remember the first time I really asked for a very high end sale, which I thought was very high end, a couple $100,000. I was like so afraid to ask for it the first time. And I was like, it was just so far out of my thought process, and I think business owners will run into that. They look at the market and they go, I am here. This market is X and I can't do beyond that because if I do beyond that, it's outside the scope of my belief system at this moment. So, and the only way to challenge that is actually, I have found to take a little test case and see if we can actually do it. And then, you move on.
You know who we start with? Our pain in the ass customers.
Yeah.
Because what's the worst that happens? We lose them. Seriously, it's a win-win no matter what happens.
There's to reaffirm what you're saying, there are many companies that we've looked at and we go, not the 80-20 rule, but the Pareto principle, but 90% of your revenue is coming from 14% of your clientele and 86% are driving 10%. But when you look at your cost invested in that 10%, it's 5 times, 4 times what it would be to actually go at these other clients or twice or whatever it could be. And so that's where you run the math, just like we were saying earlier. And it's like, okay, so what if you took all that energy you're putting into the 10% and you stuck it back into the 90%? and you know, automated it or sold off that portion of the business or whatever. There's all kinds of ways to do this, but just most people, you know, Rocky, from my perspective, most of the time it's just fear. Right? People are like, I can't do this because if I do, and usually I see on the sales side a lot, the owner is held hostage by some sales team members because of fear.
Mhm.
Right? It's like, well, if I get rid of X, Y, and Z, they're the big part of my revenue, and they're neglecting the other parts. So my philosophy is always like, let's get some people in, 3 more people who rival X, Y, and Z, and then you won't be held hostage anymore. And many times they're reluctant to do that because, well, what if they quit in the meantime? It's like, who owns the business? Do they own the business? Do you own the business? Right. And so, but every time we've ever brought the rivals in, it's funny, the XY, maybe Z leaves, but XY stays and comes into conformity of what the owner wanted in the first place. And what's a lot of fun is when we bring the people in, they outperform X and Y and Z. And so that's why Z left, because Z doesn't want to work that hard and knows that he's, you know, she or he's never gonna. So it's like, it's always this like little, you know, game, you know, fear, faith, you know, on each side of the fence. But for most business owners, I will say that I don't know of one case where business owners got hurt by actually looking at the math, running the business by the metrics. And it's objective at that point versus subjective. And it's a lot easier to make decisions off of objective data versus subjective.
I completely agree with you. And yeah, I think it's very enlightening conversation. It's one that I have every day with my clients, and it's what people have to do. So let's face it, most of this math is below 5th grade level. I always say you don't have to be smarter than a 5th grader to do it. It's pretty simple. And once you start doing it, you'll just kick yourself for not doing it sooner, because it will compound out.
It always shakes out to something meaningful, right? And the thing is, you don't have to be really good at math. And I didn't know, my wife, a super brilliant lady, she has a master's in mathematics. She tells me, she's like, how do you flip numbers in your head like that? I'm like, you're a mathematic. She's like, Doug, math isn't designed for math. It's designed to solve problems. And so when I heard that, I was like, okay, that's what we do. We measure to solve problems or, you know, help out in some capacity. So the math doesn't have to be complex math. It's very easy math, you know, because when people hear math, they get fearful about, oh, I can't do this. But all you have to do is take a look at what's going on and put some metrics and measurements against it. It'll start telling you a story for sure.
They will. And if you don't want to, you can hire somebody like us,
Yeah.
and we'll do the
Who
math.
likes doing
We'll
this
show
every
you
day?
the story, and then you can make the change, and that works too. All of it works that way. If people would like to learn more about you and your services, how do they find you?
There's a couple of different ways. I mean, they can go directly to the website, which is ceosalesstrategies.com, or send me an email at doug@ceosalesstrategies.com. If they want to peruse around on my LinkedIn, they can go to Doug Brown 123. Just type in Doug C. Brown revenue growth. I'll be everywhere on any search engines. That's another way of finding it. Or if they just want to call directly, the company phone number is 603-595-0303. I believe I'm extension 1. Just hit the number, and I'm a live person.
That he is. You heard him here live today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Rocky, thanks so much for having me here. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for listening to the entire unedited video of the Profit Answer Man podcast. You can actually get the full podcast in audio only format here on YouTube or any other of your favorite podcast players. Don't forget to go check out episodes 1 through 13. They lay out the foundation of Profit First in the book and how to get started. In addition, we've got hundreds of episodes for you to check out. And if you remember to subscribe, you'll always be updated when we put a new one out every single week. Thanks for listening. Have a profitable week.